We thought that we could use at least some minutes before we restart the seminar at lunchtime to talk about the current predicament of Brazil, because it has to do, obviously, this topic will continue to be very relevant. And the main, I would like to introduce just a question and ask both Carlos Eduardo, who is in São Paulo, is an editor of a foreign policy journal, advisor to FAPESP and to many people, important people, and also Matthew, to reflect on this, and obviously we can talk a little bit about it. There seems to be a growing understanding among various actors that this crisis, we know it's a very difficult crisis, and one of its aspects is that Brazil is probably in the second year of a 3-year recession. This is we initially, at the end of the year, were talking about a 2-year recession, and now there are economists saying that, well, this may go to 17, and we may go back to economic growth in 18. It is the first time, 2 years, I think you have to go back 80 years to see two consecutive years. 30 and 31, that we have 2 consecutive years of recession in Brazil. 3 years of consecutive recession in Brazil, I think I think it never happened, yeah. And so I assume that there are implications to all the efforts that have been done over the years to reduce implications. Obviously, we know that the state has had an important role in all of this, and budgets are tight, and they will come down, although President Rousseff is quoted into this morning's paper saying that there is nothing else to cut. Zero. But I think that things they will have to find. And this is all very obviously unfortunate. I don't want to go into discussions about the whys, because actually it will be at one point when we finally come out of this to understand properly why we had to go into this. I don't think it was inevitable. But I would like to ask both of you, is there a way that you can, at this point, measure what would be the negative consequences of the current crisis in terms of inequality? Are there policies that are being maybe thought about to face the crisis, or containing the damage, especially in relation to this topic, or is just a hopeless exercise? We are going to go through what we have to go through, and we'll see what happens. There is no doubt, apparently. Well, one of the things that are possibly went up, inflation, it's probably being contained, or so we hope. But other economic indicators are negative. So I wanted to ask each of you, and then open briefly to a discussion, if you have any thoughts about the cost of this period in terms of the topic of this excellent book. Carlos, could you go?
I'm very much an interloper here because I don't work on social inequality, but I thought about this from the perspective of judicial inequality, which is, I think, where some of the big questions lie for Brazil today. If we think about what has happened over the past 30 years in Brazil on the accountability side, it's been very positive. And there have been major gains, and unfortunately those gains, of course, don't always lead to positive outcomes. So just to unpack that, I think what we've seen is that the capacity of accountability institutions like the Ministério Público, the federal courts, the federal police, the CGU, the Comptroller General's office, institutions like the central bank, the Federal Revenue Service, all of these have gained enormously over time. And if you look at their staffing, I've gone back and I've looked at the numbers. You look at the staffing of those accountability institutions, it's more than doubled since 1989. And so there have been very important improvements in that regard. And there have also been very important sort of institutional gains. Some of them come about because of big bang reforms, like the 1988 Constitution, which defends the independence of the courts and the independence of prosecutors. But I would argue that some of the best improvements have come about through incremental change. And I think that that's a little bit of what's at the heart of the story that we can tell about inequality as well. And so if you think about the incremental changes to accountability institutions over the past 30 years, and I would say even the past 50 years, as Marta's book covers 50 years, you see really important changes in the way that these institutions function. And so, now we see accountability institutions in Brazil meet once a year to put together a national strategy for anti-money laundering and anti-corruption. As a result of this, the bureaucracies have come up with new ways of fighting money laundering, of creating databases, and closing some of the pipelines for corruption that existed in the past, like the so-called CC5 accounts in the foreign exchange accounts. But you also see learning by doing. And so one of the most interesting things I think about the Lava Jato investigations is if you look at the team of people who are involved here, you have many of them dealing with the same criminals, not just the same crimes, but the same exact criminals in two or more cases. What? Well, in this case that I'm thinking of, they are admitted criminals. So Alberto Youssef, for example, plea bargained in 2002, and he plea bargained again with the Lava Jato. And if you think about who was involved in that prosecution, and you think about who is involved in the current prosecution, it's many of the same people. 5 of the 11 prosecutors in Lava Jato participated in the Banestado case in 2002. Many of those prosecutors pushed for new laws. They pushed for a new anti-money laundering law. They pushed for a new law that defines racketeering, that defines crime organizado, organized crime. And so you do see improvements here, and I think that, not to be too coy about this or too frivolous, but the inequality in impunity is declining. And so this is I think, a very interesting phenomena, but of course it comes with all sorts of costs. And, we can talk more about this, but I guess I would sum up by saying we've seen very important progress in terms of Lava Jato. I think it is a step forward. You have prosecutors working with federal police. You have them bringing cases, and let me just highlight, that's very important. Prosecutors working with federal police has not always happened in Brazil. The fact that it's happening is unique. The fact that it's happening effectively is unique. And then they're going to court and filing these cases and filing these charges and having success. And this is, lowering the inequality in impunity. Having said that, I think that the big question that I would throw out for debate is how likely is it that this trend will continue? And, the Lava Jato prosecutions are not even halfway done. Prosecutors themselves suggest that there's a long way to go here. And so they're pulling at a string that's unraveling. Fernando and I were talking earlier. I don't know if I can say this, but I'll say it anyway. Don't cite me. you know, they're pulling a string that I think is unraveling the political system. And at some point, the pushback is going to be very significant. And already we're seeing enormous pushback on prosecutors. We're seeing enormous pushback against judges. I think that that is, of course, legitimate. It's part of what defense lawyers are paid to do. But the question is, what does that mean for the longer-term trend of improving accountability? Now, just to wrap up and say, you know, I don't want to say that this is based only on Lava Jato and Mensalão. My analysis is based on looking at data on corruption cases, for example. If you look at the trend, from your perspective, if you look at the trend in corruption cases, it's still a very small number of cases in the Brazilian judiciary. The number of cases of corruption that were heard last year were about 500 in a universe of 95, excuse me, I've got the numbers backward. 26,000 in a universe of 95 million. So still a very small percentage. And then the number of imprisoned, jailed corruptors is about 500 in a universe of 600,000. So in both cases, a very small proportion. But nonetheless, the trend is a positive one. And so Lava Jato and the Mensalão, and I think some of these big name scandals are very much, I think, off the curve. They don't represent necessarily what's been going on in the courts, but they do nonetheless represent the trend that we're seeing. And so we have this big question, which is this positive trend going to continue, and how tolerable is it for the political system as a whole? So I'll throw those out as questions.
I just wanted to add one information that comes from a set of polls that we produced with a Brazilian firm, Ideia Inteligência from São Paulo, a sample of 20,000, more than 20,000 voters in 145 cities that relates to this. The question, two questions. One was Lava Jato statement. Lava Jato is one of the main causes of the current Brazilian economic problems. Agree or disagree? 2/3 of Brazilians disagree with that statement. Second question. Considering the negative impact that the investigations, the anti-corruption investigations have had and continue to have in the economy, because as you know, involves Petrobras, construction companies, etc. Acknowledging that and considering that not as a cause of the problem, but as a factor, current reality, should Lava Jato be suspended in order to give some room for the economy to move up? 88% in two polls in September last year, January of this year, say no, it should not be suspended. So, public prosecutors, and we have one of them with us today, must feel probably pretty much supported in what they are doing. I think this is a very important factor. And this is probably a new factor in Brazil in terms of what you just mentioned, the inequality of impunity. I think Brazilian society has matured and it feels that it's somewhat represented. Remember, the former country of assured impunity is apparently tired of being that. How, and again, go back to your question, how we are going to actually continue to move ahead, because this could certainly have a very difficult, destructive actually impact on the political system. But my continue what you said, I think that there is very good news, hopefully, in the bad news, which is the crisis. Okay. Your turn.
Yeah, both Matthew and Paulo have already offered the silver lining of our crisis.
Yes.
But I don't want to play Pollyanna. All this is really beautiful, and I agree 100%, but I'm not going to repeat it. Okay. I would add one more thing. The military are quiet. They are put. Remember, the present defense minister of Brazil is not only a civilian, but a registered member of the Communist Party of Brazil. So this, for a person of my age, is inconceivable. The military obeying a communist. Okay, that he's not a typical communist, but anyway, he is a communist. But we are in dire straits. It's really a very, very bad situation, no doubt. And of course, this economic situation will hurt all the advances that are discussed in this beautiful book, and that is one of the prides of Brazil in this century. We will have trouble to maintain the trend of reducing inequality, although it's not impossible to continue in that line. Even economically, there are some good news. The external accounts are still in order. We have reserves of almost $400 billion. Brazil is cheap, so many investors are buying things in Brazil because of the real devaluation. Many companies are investing in Brazil, companies that have been in Brazil for decades. They know that Brazil will not die. They know that Brazil will continue being a big country, a big market where they have already made much money and will make more. They are creating a hedge for them. They are creating an asset of trusting in the country when the country is in a bad situation. So there are economical reasons also to not be totally fatalistic about the future of Brazil in the next 10, 15 years. But there are some problems that are real problems for this year that if they are not solved, situation can get much worse. For instance, the fiscal responsibility law, which was one of the greatest achievements of Brazil, when we finally stopped with states and municipalities that were always in debt and we would never be punished and would never stop being in debt. Today, states are going into the federal government and trying to get a way out of their situation, which is so bad or worse than the federal government situation. And there is some political wish to concede. And this is a big trouble. We cannot go back to the situation of the 80s and early 90s when we had all the states in a quasi-bankrupt situation. Second, one of the consensus that we have had in Brazil and that President Lula has honored is that we have to have primary surpluses. We are entering this year with a budget that in the law, the budget says we are going to have 0.5% of the GDP primary surplus. The government is trying to change that in order to create a band so that it would be legal having either 1% less or 1% more. And of course that it will be less because it's clear already that this 0.5% primary surplus will not be achieved. This is another danger. If we forget what we have been doing for 20 years, that one of the goals, the priority goals of the administration is to have some primary surplus, this is really dangerous for the middle and long term. And even in the silver lining, the leniency law is being changed already. There is information that the medida provisória that was sent to the Congress was changed in two vital points that would give room for the companies that are caught in corruption acts be able to continue doing business with the government without much hurt, and the owners and the managers of those companies would not be subject to any kind of criminal persecution. So we made so many advances, and they are so important. that we cannot concede, give up from these achievements that we did in the last 20, 25 years. The economic situation is very bad. We all are going to suffer a lot with what's going to happen in the next 2 years. But the substantial things that we achieved, the faith in democracy, the faith in reducing inequality, the faith on having a mature and sound economic macro policies. This cannot be changed. We cannot give up these conquers. Otherwise, then we will be in real trouble.
Well, Carlos, thank you very much. No, this was just comments. We are going now to return to the book, and we are 2 minutes ahead of schedule, I want to tell you. So there is, you know,
Management, you see.
this is crisis management. This is, there is hope in the future. So I would like to invite, Carlos is now going to preside, and we need Marta back, Eduardo Marques, and Peter Ward at that table. And
Como é que é o tempo aqui?
não, o Serguei é a próxima. É, ó, você tem
Não,
até 3h30.
significa o quê?
Você
Uma
tem
hora e meia?
Você administra.
São
Não,
duas,
é 15, são duas apresentações.
duas apresentações, então dá para
Você
ser
tem
20 minutos para cada um.
20, commentator 15.
Tá.
Você tem um bom tempo. Se você
bom
puder
tempo.
fazer em menos, manda
bom.
mais. Né?
Tá bom.
E se você quiser acrescentar alguma coisa, acrescente. Você é o presidente da mesa, o presidente ditatorial. Eu sou a favor. Acho que o presidente tem que presidir. Como disse o Delfim Neto.
Você vai mudar as plaquinhas das pessoas ou não?
Vou dar a plaquinha. A sua plaquinha. Peter. Your turn. Here. Essa plaquinha vai aqui. Não, Mr. Sergey is in the next round. Marta, where is Marta's thing?
A Marta não está nessa mesa.
Tá nesse próximo. Papel.
A Marta? Ah, é. How is Austin?
have been for Matthew because he did 3 or 4, had to do 3 or 4 interventions.
Cadê os outros debatedores? Cadê o Eduardo?
Tá aqui fora, deixa eu chamar ele.
Então vamos lá.
Esse capítulo aí traz. Deixa eu ver se o capítulo agora tá
Você
certo
vai achar
aqui.
o seu coisa agora? Okay, let's reconvene. Eduardo, can you please come in? É isso aí? So, let's start our next session, which is about urban infrastructure and services. And the first speaker is Eduardo Marcos, professor at the University of São Paulo. Are you going to use the 20 minutes, okay?
Okay. 20.
20, I'm generous.
I was targeting 15.
If you want to use only 15.
No,
use
no, no,
only
no,
15.
no, no, no. Okay.
city.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Marta and Paulo for the opportunity of presenting this chapter. And and this chapter discusses urban conditions in Brazilian cities in the last 50 years. Okay, it's a difficult topic to analyze using demographic data in the Brazilian case, because the information from the census has a series of limitations to discuss housing and urban conditions. Actually, we have only a few variables associated to service coverage. So it's really difficult and almost nothing in the long run with stable variables to analyze housing and precarity itself. So it's really difficult to discriminate service quality and also to discuss in more details housing precarity and environmental conditions. Okay, but on the other hand, the census information is the only information with reliable methodology and stable methodology through time and with national coverage. So it's the only thing that we have to analyze this kinds of issues for 50 years. Okay. Considering this, the theme of urban conditions has been polarized by two generic visions in the Brazilian case, both by Brazilian authors and authors from other countries. In one case, people who stress the general improvement of living conditions, a kind of optimistic assessment of the situation. And the other one, in another group of analysis, which is, I think, the majority of the authors, especially the Brazilian authors, stresses the long-lasting precarity and inequality of access to policies and urban conditions. It's a kind of a pessimistic view associated to some kind of everything is going to hell analysis of urban conditions in Brazilian cities. Okay? And this chapter tries to nuance these two visions, suggesting at the same time intense improvement on service coverage and provision, but also stressing the stability and reconfiguration of durable inequalities in the conditions of Brazilian cities. Okay. Before entering the subject itself, we have to keep in mind that the production of cities, quote unquote, is a moving challenge in the Brazilian city, has been a moving challenge in the Brazilian cities. Since the Brazilian urban population was 13 million people in 1940, became 31 million people in 1960, became 80 million people in 1980, and 161 million in 2010. So we are talking about a process in which the state is producing in its three levels administrative capacities, technical communities, it's financing services, constructing things and everything, but at the same time the cities, the problem itself is growing very fast. So it's really, really a challenge. Okay. Considering housing tenure, we don't have reliable information about tenure. What we have in the census, what we have is the information of ownership, self-reported by the person who lives there, and the result is this: we have an increase of ownership through time, and a very, very fast and obviously associated decrease in rented and other situations. Rented is the most important other form of ownership or of tenure. In fact, the problem is this ownership statistics hides precarity and irregularity. So people who live in slums, who live in favelas, who live in irregular settlements, precarious settlements, clandestine settlements, report that their own ownership as owned. Okay, so it's kind of tricky data, but it suggests or gives a broad picture of the Brazilian housing conditions as associated much more with ownership and not with rent. Okay, we had also a very strong decrease through time, a very strong decrease of household size for all social groups. This is the average amount of persons per household, household density, dividing the information in three different, two different social groups, 60% richest and 40% poorest, and they decline over time. The tendency is the same for metropolitan region, so the average household is declining, has been declining. The households with no bathroom were reduced strongly in the last 20 years. So in the blue line, we have this information, the percentage of households without a bathroom for the 40% lowest families, and they decreased very, very strongly. But it's still, this statistics still represents 7% of the population with the 40% poorest households in Brazil. So it's still important. Okay, and the coverage for different services increased continuously in the last 50 years, although with different rates. Here we have the coverage for energy services. Here we have the coverage for water services. Here we have sewage and garbage collection. Garbage collection, we have the information only from 91 on. And we can see that these three services, well, all of them increased the coverage since 60, but all these three services increased, not only increased, but reached almost universalization, while sewage continues to be lagging behind. Okay, and this also happened between social groups within the cities. So if we open the information of the coverage for three groups of income, 40% lowest families, lowest income families, the 50% intermediary, and the 10% richest families, the situation is the same. This is energy, and in the three groups, for the three groups, universalization was achieved. Obviously, in all the graphs I'm going to show, the poorest social group has lower coverage at the beginning of the period, but in this case, they reach the same kind of coverage at the end. The results for water are similar, although some inequalities still exist. Okay. Also for garbage collection. Sorry. What did I do? Okay.
Pray.
Also for garbage collection, I have to say that, to stress again, that the information does not allow any discussion about the quality of the service. So we do not know. Well, this is garbage collection with collection in front of the house. Okay, domestic housing collection, not in house dumps. Waste dumps. Not only dumps. Okay. So it's more, but we don't have, for example, for this, we don't know how many of these households of each of the groups had their garbage deposed in correct, environmentally correct places. Okay, So we don't have information about the quality of the service. And then sewage is the system in which the inequalities are still very large and the coverage is still small. So for the 10% higher, we still have 82%, only 82% of coverage. For the poorest social groups, we have less than 50% of the population associated or connected to a sewage system network. Well, but anyway, there was a generalized increase in service coverage in a lower pace for sewage, but it was something that happened for the whole Brazilian situation. And the inequalities that still exist for the whole country are associated to sewage services. However, we at the beginning of the study, we knew that a lot these broad general average data hide a lot of inequalities inside the information. Okay, so to further explore these inequalities, I did a cluster analysis of the nine original metropolitan regions, separating each of the metropolitan regions' population by income groups. So we have, for example, Rio de Janeiro, the top 10% highest income, the 40%, 50% intermediary, and the 40% poorer population of Rio de Janeiro. So I have 3 Rio de Janeiros. Okay, so we have 27 metropolitan regions and 21 variables of urban conditions. And this, and I did a cluster analysis of this, and the results suggest a superposition of regional and social inequalities. So we ended up with 4 groups considering the living conditions that have the first one, which has the lowest coverage, has 40% lowest, poorest population of Belém, Fortaleza, and Recife, and the 50% median of Belém. So the middle classes in Belém, being, I have to apologize to Carlos especially for the use of middle class here, but the 50% intermediate classes in Belém have the same living conditions of the poorest part of the population. Group 2 involves 40% lowest in Salvador, Belém, Rio de Janeiro, and Porto Alegre, 50% in Fortaleza, Recife, and Salvador, as well as the 10% richest in Belém. So the 10% richest families in Belém have the same living conditions of the 40% lowest, the poor population of Salvador, Belo Horizonte, Rio de Janeiro, and Porto Alegre. And the same thing happens with the other ones, okay? So we have superposition of regional and social inequalities inside each of the metropolitan regions, suggesting that the average coverages hide a heterogeneity that cannot be analyzed with this kind of data and would have to be analyzed at the level of intra-urban information, which cannot be analyzed at the scale of the whole country, because we would have to go to the inside of each of the metropolitan regions and analyze the spaces of these places. Okay, so in face of important inequality reduction on average service coverages, inequalities persist both regionally and socially. In fact, they combine each other, equalizing the conditions of richest groups in some regions to median and poor groups in others. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Marta?
May I have the okay. Okay. Well, I'll depart from the point where Eduardo stopped by saying that there is a geography of all this story Eduardo just told. And And I start by saying that the urban conditions the household access to urban conditions or many kinds of services is not fully explained by the household income, but it's also explained by the place where you live. So depending on the city you live in Brazil, the living conditions you have access to highly changed. That's why Eduardo says that if you were middle or intermediate or something like that, if you have a middle income position in the income distribution, you can have very different housing or services conditions depending on the city where you live. And what does explain that? My proposition is that the decision to provide services, the supply decision, depends on the scale of consumers. So, and my chapter shows that poor people concentration is a good predictor of the supply of services, and I will show you some data on that in a minute. So, it's possible to calculate the Gini coefficient of cross-municipality coverage rates regarding many services. Let me just provide you an example. So we can assume that each municipality, the total numbers of municipality. Let me start again. The universe of municipalities in Brazil is a population, and you can't compare the coverage rates of access to electric power, to water supply, to sewage collection, and so over time. Calculating the Gini coefficient, which shows the inequality of supply among them. So what do we see? Oh, I understand what's happening now. We are, okay. What should we press here?
A setinha pro lado.
A vermelha?
Ou a setinha para cima.
Okay. Okay. So look at this. So these are the value of the Gini coefficients in many. I can imagine you can see that, but the inequality on electric power supply in Brazil, among Brazilian municipalities, is nearly zero now, as Eduardo has showed, because access to electric power is now universal. It sharply declined. Inequality among Brazilian municipalities in piped water, also access to piped water also declined. In sewage collection is still high, but it has declined. And let me see, and in access to education declined. Inequality in doctor supply remained the same. And inequality in poor people concentration indeed increased. Poor people concentration here is calculated by the population, the share of the population whose households have one minimum wage earnings. So people affected by the Bolsa Família program is not into this calculation, and I will show you in a minute why. So the inequality in poor people concentration indeed increased, and many indicators remain the same, but inequality in GDP per capita is also stable. But there is a geography of this story. So at the very beginning, inequality in poor people concentration was indeed low because poverty was widespread, And this sharp divide between the richest region and, the richest and the poorest it started during the military regime, basically after the economic miracle, which had a geographic shape, right? And it remained this way, and it was a bit alleviated, but let me say you that Bolsa Familia is not included here. This is the population whose earnings are equal or above the minimum wage. Okay, so if I look at the access to electric power, it was, see that after the military regime, it was almost, let me just explain how to look at this map. They are organized in order to highlight to present in darker tones the highest rates of coverage. So the darker the best, okay? The darker the better. So in the 80s, access to electricity was almost universal in São Paulo, whereas it didn't, it was not available in the Northeast. Look at this, even the democratization period made, because this sharp division remained. It lessened a little bit, basically along the terms of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, but it became universal, not in the sense that it reached the poorest, it reached the least supplied regions. There is a point I should call your attention, because there is a widespread literature saying that the support for the Workers' Party in the Northeast is explained mainly by Bolsa Familia program, as if the only change that Northeast region underwent was Bolsa Familia. I'll show you that electricity power reached this region at this period as well, and economists say that it is important for economic development besides minimum wage and Bolsa Familia as well. So look at water supply. At the very beginning, inequality was very low, except for São Paulo, where rates of coverage were higher. During the military regime, supply increased here. The big divide is still present. Look at what happened with water supply in the Northeast. Sewage collection. We are used to say that sewage collection is a big challenge in Brazil nowadays because it's the worst policy in terms of supply. But this need is concentrated. There is a geography of this need, and it is a need whose the satisfaction of the state capacity to supply this need requires a lot of investments, but they are concentrated. It is concentrated in the poorest regions. So it's the same for garbage collection. So see that there is a sharp divide between regions that still remains. So there is and look what happened with doctors' supply. There was concentration of supply in this region, a huge absence here, and there is first it improves in the Northeast region, and there is a low inequality now in the sense that it's more or less widespread, the supply of doctors. Okay, so what's the point? And is that the supply of services, the decision of companies or the decision made by state government agencies to offer these services highly depends on the concentration of poor people in jurisdictions. As poor people concentration poor people is concentrated in the northeast of Brazil, the needs are also concentrated in this region. This region is always, although each policy shows its own speed, the northeast region is always the last one to be supplied, and universalization means reaching the northeast region. So what happened is that the association between coverage rates and poor people concentration is still high, but it's been declining over time. So somehow the big effort has been to delink the supply of services from poor people concentration. It's still very high in education. It is still very high in garbage collection, and it's still, look that these levels of association did not decline. So change in education started here, and it's been more or less stable, and even increasing a little bit. So the main idea is that this is a dimension we should look at when we, I'm concluding, yeah. This is a dimension, it's interesting to look at, because it's the geography of inequality has been somehow under studied in Brazil more recently. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint, so. Well, once again, thank you so much to Marta and Paulo for inviting me here today. I'm not a Brazilian specialist. I do work extensively on Latin America, and including Brazil. Most of my work on these particular issues in terms of housing and social services provision has really been developed in the context of Mexico, and indeed work that I was doing a couple of decades ago, really. Certainly I enjoyed reading both of these papers very much. I think they complement each other very well. I read them, Marta's paper first, and the order in which they come in the book, and then Eduardo's. It's been flipped around today. But they do complement. I think it's actually quite important, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, to take these two papers together, to read them side by side. Let me just make a couple of points in terms of, it's a high quality volume. Thank you so much for providing English translations. I assume it's going to come out in English, we hope. That being the case, I would suggest two things. One, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier, Marta, that it would be helpful, I think, for an English-speaking non-Brazilianist audience to have a really good base map of Brazil and the cities in Brazil, and I'll explain why in a second. I would also put in a plea to increase the size of the legends of some of these graphs, because they are very difficult to read. I was expanding my PDF almost so it was going off the map, and I still couldn't see it terribly clearly. So they are difficult to read sometimes, these labels. David Lamb's graphs today were, I think, the best we've seen so far in terms of the quality and the clarity of them. So please do increase the size of the legends. And clearly, if it's going to be reproduced in grayscale, then you're not going to get the level of nuanced reading that you provided there with the color, and that applies also to some of the graphs that have superb graphs in color. Whether you can read the legends or not, it's sometimes difficult to track through on the colors. So these are common problems. The way I got around this recently was by, in terms of a book I've just done, was to make sure that all of the graphs were in color. That raised the price of the book a little bit, but it was the only way I could get, if you're going to use maps, it's the only way you can really proceed. I was reminded, as you said, geography matters, going back to Doreen Massey's 1985 book called Geography Matters. And it really matters very much in the context of these two papers. I've produced or drafted my comments on each of the papers individually, and I'll be happy to send those to you. But what I'm going to try and do here for the sake of brevity is to try and fold my comments to embrace both papers, addressing the sort of common directions of your arguments, and then reserve a few specifics for each paper as appropriate. Both, as you've seen, both papers examine the expansion of infrastructure services in Brazil from 1970 census data to 2010. Both address the same set of infrastructure services, namely energy, water provision, sanitation, sewage, and then you have the garbage collection service from 1991 onwards, and both show a trend towards greater or lesser extent of universalization in terms of the provision of those two services. Where they differ and where they complement each other is that Marta's study, as you've just seen, both are examining the geographical expansion. In Marta's case, in terms of across the regions of Brazil, and in Eduardo's case, also across the regions, but looking differentially at the major metropolitan areas. In terms of the cities, the metropolitan areas, I think there are 27, was it 21 or 27? I think it's 27. Both show significant, maybe even dramatic improvement and expansion. The trajectories show the increase in terms of coverage and the expansion of that coverage from 1970 to 2010. 1970, I think you said, I think the term you used in English was terrible conditions. And this is generally the case in major Latin American cities. When I was doing my work on social welfare provision in Mexico, it was exactly the same. 1970 were dire, very low rates of, according to the census data at least, in terms of bathroom coverage, water coverage, even electricity coverage, and so forth. So dramatic expansions, but both show how there is the inequality in terms of the rates and expansion to regions or across regions or within cities, and I like the idea of cities within cities, between the social groups that you talk about, that there are very important inequalities in terms of that provision. And these are not commonly seen. We don't usually disaggregate these levels of inequality or this understanding of inequality when we look more generally at changing inequality levels in countries like Brazil. So both are showing that in terms of, we've just seen, in terms of the Gini coefficients, in terms of these services, service provision, major divides in access regionally, and then regionally and within cities in terms of between socioeconomic groups, in terms of Eduardo's paper. Both use interesting and similar techniques to explore and try and disaggregate these processes. You start off, Marta, using your graphs of Gini coefficients showing inequality, changing equality or inequality levels, and improving equality levels in terms of Gini coefficients from 70 through. So using factor analysis, in fact, in Marta's case, she uses factor analysis to start off with to create what she calls, and you didn't talk about this today, and it is actually a synthetic indicator score of services. And then she shows how this synthetic, if you like, composite indicator across those services have the trajectories of those over time and by region. And you have some really cool box plots which show how these have generally all improved, they've all gone up, but that in certain regions you've got a much higher dispersion. I think the Northeast and the North have a much higher, continue to have much higher dispersion levels. So I would recommend that you take a look at those box plots. They're very interesting. Eduardo, as you've seen, looks at urbanization rates, starts off talking about the dramatic urbanization rates, pretty much urban populations increasing 2.5 times every 20 years. So it becomes a very, and that's an important point in terms of the backdrop to service provision, infrastructure provision, as a society moves from being a rural society predominantly to being an urban society. And we're talking about absolute numbers, huge absolute numbers in terms of the increased urban population. And then looks at, he also uses factor analysis and then the cluster analysis to try and look at the distribution of these infrastructure services to the bottom 40%, to the median 50%, and then to the top 10%. And you saw the 4 groups that come out of that. I'm not going to repeat what you've just said because you've shown us the distribution. I was struck by Belém. I mean, if there's a basket case in Brazil, it has to be that. I don't know Belém, but clearly there's something going on in that particular city which needs to be explained. And I think we were talking this morning. I think Adrian said that we don't do so much case studies as we used to in the context of Brazil. But I think that's a classic case where if you do this more general disaggregated analysis, if it was me, I would send one of my doctoral students up there to find out, using a more qualitative and mixed method techniques, to find out what is going on in the context of Belém to make it so challenged in terms of its capacity or incapacity to provide services. So, okay, specific comments and discussion points to both of you. First point, I think, and this is specific to Marta, I was, unlike Eduardo, you didn't talk about urbanization rates. Good, thank you. And what I'm a little bit surprised that I would have expected, I wonder why you didn't include in your, what did you call it, your synthetic indicator, why you didn't include a variable that actually looked at the proportion rural, proportion urban in terms of municipalities. What I'm saying here is it's much easier to extend, or it's much more, you're going to extend into urban areas the infrastructure in the first instance. And if you have certain regions of the country which are much more rural at different points in time, then aren't you inevitably going to get differential introduction of the services? So I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't some sort of, it might be difficult to create, but you have to change a different cutoff for urban and rural at different time horizons. But I think that, or you could create a dummy variable, majority rural, majority urban by municipalities. I think that would have been interesting. For both of you, I think, and 2 issues I'd like to lay out for discussion relate to the features that really are important in determining these trajectories and outcomes. First is the way in which infrastructure provision has to be sequenced. You mention, but you don't really dwell upon, the idea of supplying, generating the energy, generating water provision, has to be sequenced in terms of as a collective good. Earlier work that we've done, I think you mentioned this in your talk, that really back in the 1960s and 70s, the primary concern then was to ratchet up the production of energy, production and capacity of water. How you can interpret that, was it for the good of the masses? Well, no, it was essentially to underpin and undergird industrial production and expansion. And what some of us have shown is that that's the first, that's essential in terms of sequencing, and that only latterly after that can you begin to sort of think about extending to cities in the first instance and so forth. So I think in large part what this explains is the hiatus, the fact that there wasn't, that the servicing levels were so low in 1970, but that they began to come online in the 1980s and 1990s. You refer to the late Vilma Faria arguing that the 80s actually weren't the lost decade. They were in some respects, but they weren't in terms of building the basic capacity to then begin to extend the service provision thereafter. I think that's what you see in terms of your sequencing. You see, obviously, the South in the first instance, then the Center-West, and then essentially the differential movement out to the North-Northeast, even though it is differential and a far lesser speed and so forth. So I think more recognition of just the inevitable way in which you're going to sequence or the provision infrastructure or the provision of social services, I think is an important point to raise. The second point, I think, and this relates perhaps more to the development of the sort of things that Eduardo's talking about, is that that we've seen particularly since the 1990s, really quite a dramatic ratcheting up of the capacity of cities in particular to they're more transparent, they're more accountable, they're politically accountable, doing a better job in terms of providing services and infrastructure to those who require it, who demand it, has been very much a part of the decentralization, the good governance, and so forth. And so, again, this comes back to this idea of the urban areas, I think, are going to be in a much better, much more likely to be able to produce this, and deliver this infrastructure than our rural areas. And I think that relates to something that you didn't mention, but is actually quite an important point you raise in your presentation. That, okay, I'm almost done. That it's municipalities, the better off municipalities are the ones that are able to deliver these services. And I think that's inevitable because they're capable of generating internal revenues much better than, let's say, rural municipalities. But they're also likely to have the administrative infrastructure. That often is, the administrative infrastructure often leaves a lot to be desired, but I think there is an improvement process going on in terms of the expectation that cities and city administrations deliver. And we saw some very interesting, the councils this morning in terms of are a part of that process in terms of sectorally. So I think both these are very important background variables, I think, that one needs to understand. Sequencing and the quality of city administrations and the improving quality of city administrations, I think, are very important when we start to try and disaggregate servicing inequalities. On final points, I have a few final points on Eduardo, which I may not be able to get into. In terms of actual housing aspects. One thing that's been a real concern of mine, and this goes to what you were saying about how, well, you mentioned quality. Quality is that, I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we're extending these services. If you don't actually also try and get a sense of quality, and I'm thinking particularly in 1980s, 70s and 80s, when the first extension took place of energy and water. Yes, you have electric light, but then it cuts out every other day, or water is undrinkable, or only occurs. So, so again, as supply is increased, as administrations become more accountable, then I think you're likely to get a better quality of service, one hopes. And if you don't, then in democratic society, you can get rid of your administrators, one assumes. final point is just that when you're trying to do this sort of more micro intra-urban analysis, I would just make a plea. When we think about informal settlements, you mentioned this morning, you talked about informal settlements. What about informal settlements? You said, what about the favelas? There's a real issue both in Brazil but also in Argentina, where people tend to obsess about the favelas. And in fact, favelas, or their equivalent, the villas in Rio, in Buenos Aires, are actually a very small, relatively small proportion of the informal settlements. It's much more broader in terms of servicing provision. The informal, the loteamientos, the loteos populares, the colonias populares, what you ever call them. That's a much larger universe, and it's a very different universe. They're both informal. They're both self-built. Different locations usually. Favelas are more inner city. Villas are more inner city. The loteamientos are on the periphery. Very different physical structures, or rather different physical structures. Different capacities and ease with which one can intervene in terms of providing basic services. And one thing you didn't talk about, but you do talk about in the paper, which I think is a little bit confusing, is the subnormal category. I'm not sure what subnormal areas are, whether they're objective criteria or subjective criteria. I can understand how an administrator might want to identify certain neighborhoods as no-go areas, but I'm not sure it's a terribly helpful or interesting variable identifier in terms of looking at micro areas within cities. I've obviously gone on rather longer than I should have done. I apologize.
Thank you, Peter. Comments, questions? The floor is open. Please.
I'm quite interested in the process you show, Marta, in particular the geographic spread of coverage of basic kinds of municipal services. And I'm just curious as to how much of that you see, how much of that is being driven by national level political pressures and the responsiveness of the federal government. How much of it is more of a bottom-up dynamic that is going to vary across municipalities according to their political capacities or the economic resources they have. How much of it is simply a diffusion process where you have an imitation, or where some municipalities come along later, but they see what other municipalities have done, and so you see a process diffusing. But I'm just curious as to how you see those different kinds of political logics playing out and what the balance between them might be.
Yes.
I wonder if you could explain to me what it means exactly. If you could explain just a little bit what it means exactly for the richest 10% in Belém to be in the same condition as the poorest 40% in Salvador, for example. I mean, are you talking only about public provision? Because presumably the richest 10% in Belém is making use of various forms of private provision of services, just as, in fact, in many other cities, wealthier parts of the population have always done. So anyway, so I guess I just wanted to know what that meant.
Marta and Edu, you both showed in your presentations that the sewage collection went kind of in a lower pace than the other public services. And I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that point. I mean, how would you explain this? Is it because of the, I don't know, the specificity of the service provided? Does it have to do with our federative system? Or I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, thank you. So actually, after hearing different panels, we actually see different tendencies in terms of decrease or increase in different policy areas. So I actually begin to make the connections between different panels. So for instance, in the morning we heard something about the increase in councils and associations. Then that make me to think what kind of role this factor plays in terms of explaining some of the tendencies we are seeing in the urban arena, like the different data Marta shows. So I wonder if Marta or Eduardo can make a comment about that, like how the different tendencies, whether there are some causal relations between the different tendencies, especially the increase in council versus the urban services. And a specific question for Eduardo is, because I'm very interested in the issue of housing, and you said in terms of housing tenure there is this increase in ownership in both this formal and also the illegal or irregular forms. And I wonder if you can, I want to push you whether you can offer some explanations. Does it has anything to do with the federal programs, including Minha Casa Minha Vida, or the regularization process in the informal settlements, or some other factors? Because we still do see this highly unequal distribution of land and housing in Brazilian cities. Thank you.
Okay, why don't you have 5 minutes each now? If somebody else wants to speak later, we can. If we have time, we can take other questions. Okay. Okay. So Eduardo, 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. Actually, a lot of things. It will be hard to stick to the 5 minutes, but let's try. And thanks, Peter, for your comments. Well, I have done a lot of work of the cities within the city. Actually, my scale of analysis is much more detailed. Usual scale of analysis is much more detailed than this, using both quantitative and qualitative data. So it was a concern for me in this paper to try to find a way of getting the inter-urban without having intra-urban data, because we could not match the information with the census tracts or with the waiving areas of the census, because the information of we had would not allow this. So one of the things that I think this chapter does not do is to analyze informal settlements, and I'm very sad about this also, because I've dedicated a lot of pages to analyze informal settlements in Brazil, and we have developed a method for the Ministry of Cities to analyze for the whole Brazil, but with the information departing from the information of the census, but trying to solve the problems the information of the census have, to get to informal settlements all over Brazil. And this became a study of using the 2000 census, but we couldn't use the same information, the same methodology now in this study, because we would lose completely the time. We'll have only the information of the 2000 and maybe the 2010 census. In any case, the Belém is a city that has, considering not the information of the census, which is the subnormal. I'm going to explain the subnormal in a second, but according to the results of our study to the Ministry of Cities, has 50% of the metropolitan region of Belém lives in informal, in assentamentos precários, in precarious settlements. This includes favelas, irregular settlements, and clandestine settlements. Okay, so it's really, really large number. It's Salvador is 24, São Luís is 28, São Paulo is 12. Only to give you some benchmark of this. So Belém is a city that has a lot of urban precarity. What's the subnormal? Subnormal is a classification of the census tract that IBGE publishes since 2000. The information is more or less available for 91 also, but it's an information that was used to organize the census internally by the Census Bureau. And urban scholars and sociologists started to use this information to analyze favelas and precarity in the city, stretching a lot the use that was there. Because the subnormal they classify the census tract as subnormal to be able to pay more for the guy who is going to run the survey, and to be able to train the guy differently from the guy who will do the other census tract, as they do with all the census tracts which are classified as special. Okay, you have several types, and you have the non-special. These types, for example, the guy who is going to survey an indigenous village has a special training. The guy who does a precarious settlement has a special training. So it's a classification of the census tract, and it's done before the census, because they have to have the map to be able to hire the guys and train the guys. And the persons started to use this information, but this information was produced to, so it's an information which at the same time is very interesting, but it means another thing. Okay, so this method we created for the Ministry of Cities was intended to use the census, the subnormal information, to solve the problems of the subnormal information with a lot of statistical methods, and to be able to analyze in the intra-urban scale. MEGCAC, public provision or private provision in Belém. Well, the majority of these things I'm talking about are not solvable by private. They are public goods. The guys cannot get rid of the water system. I'm saying that in Belém you have elite neighborhoods which are really, really close to places where sewage is running in the river directly. So the urban conditions are really worse. Necessary sequence of the infrastructure, you are completely right. And I think several of these elements are policy specific. So you have, for example, water, even in favelas, water and energy entered first in favelas. And they entered first, water and has to enter first before sewage by logical reasons, but it enters first also because they are simpler to install and they can be removed. So there are several institutional elements associated to the policies themselves, and there were certain technical innovations in the 90s associated to the tubes, to new materials that allowed entering favelas before with water and not only favelas, irregular settlements in general, precarious settlements, then sewage. So sewage has several technical elements associated to it. There's one interesting thing that we have discussed these two papers together several times, and there's one interesting thing that me and Marta, I think we agree completely that administrative capacities in municipalities have been risen in Brazil very strongly in the last years. And we agree that this is important, this is good, and this is important to this result. But the connections are not really, really simple, because the large majority of the services which are here and are there are state-run policies. They are implemented by state governments, not municipalities. What would suggest some state how do you say this? State manchas, state plots. The plots would be, geographical distribution would be much more state-like than it is, because the major sewage, water, energy, they are state implemented. Okay, the quality, I agree completely. Quality is the challenge for the services themselves and also for research. And we don't have the tools, the services do not have the tools either, but we don't have the tools already to analyze quality. Relations with participation. Well, the large majority of these, I think all these policies, at least my policies, not Marta had also health in her slides, but water, sewage, urban stuff belong to the last type of council participation in Adrian's presentation, the ones that had near zero in the large majority of the municipalities. So the degree of participation in these policies is very, very low, has been very, very low in Brazil. One last question about ownership, which was, the thing is, this information from the census has to do, it's a survey that the person asks the informant, the person who lives there, is this house yours? And the person says, yes. Okay? So the person who lives in a favela or in a regular settlement or in a clandestine settlement, they consider even juridically, the house is theirs. What's not theirs is the plot, the land. So, but even so, they do not do this reasoning. But in any case, the other possibility would be rent, and the person does not pay rent. So the house belongs to him or her. Okay.
The issue is that the census accepts
Yeah. So in that curve, we have everything together. We have the spread in the 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when the two lines cross. We had everything. We had the migration from the countryside and the development of the peripheries, the vast peripheries of Brazilian metropolitan regions. We had favelas and regular settlements being built, and you had also a lot of construction in regular places in which people became. But the thing is, the precarious solution of the second part of the 20th century is associated with ownership, which is favela and precarious settlement. The precarious solution for poor people at the beginning of the 20th century, which was cortiço, tenements, was associated with rent. So they are different in a sense, in the sense of urban conditions.
Okay, Marta?
So I'll try to be, but first of all, thanks a lot, Peter, for the detailed reading and the wonderful comments, and thanks for the questions. I'll try to answer them once again, departing from where Eduardo stopped, but and I think I can wrap up them, except for Peter's question about why not including the distinction between rural and urban areas in my analysis, and I have to confess it never occurred to me. I have to say that I tried correlations with any variable that
It's because your center is urban studies, right?
Yeah, we don't study rural areas, yeah. Where we have a bias against rural areas. Yeah, but thanks a lot. It never occurred to me. I don't know why. I'm surprised as well. Why I didn't thought.
Could rerun the model just by differentiating.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Okay. But I'll try to answer all the remaining questions, beginning by Kenneth's question about the political story behind this process. These three policies were the priority for the military regime when the idea was to develop the economy. So there would be huge investments in creating nationwide funding for building sewage collection, electric supply, and water supply services. but they were organized in state-level companies, so supply was provided by state-level companies, and there were two types of subsidies. One, from richer municipalities to poorer ones within states. So provision is not, that's why provision is not explained why better off municipalities deliver policies, but why they are chosen by state-level companies to be the first. Because if provision is made to richer, better off municipalities, the collection of revenues would make it possible to expansion of services. And then there was a huge flux of subsidies from richer states from poorer ones. The system operated in such a way that only São Paulo, the state of São Paulo, and the federal district had surplus. The remaining states were deficitary. And so they received money from São Paulo and the federal district. So it worked this way during the military regime. During democratization, the funding capacity of the Brazilian state broke. And then it began all this story about who is going to invest. And there is a big division between left-wing parties, which that believe that it's up to the state to fund all provision, and conservative parties that believe that it's a matter of privatization. So you should transfer to private companies. Obviously, private companies want better off municipalities because poorer ones cannot afford to pay. So there is a big divide along this issue of subsidies and funding. And why is it that sewage is so low? The provision of sewage is so low. Peter's answer would be it's a matter of sequency.
And Eduardo
says that, oh, it's a matter of engineering as well, because there are technical challenges that must be faced to. So once you made investments on the production of energy, it's only a matter of extending provision. Whereas in sewage collection, you need huge systems, facilities, I don't know the technical word to say that, but they must be built on a decentralized way. So but in sewage, there is a huge institutional, how can I say that? When there is a sort of stalemate, because municipalities have the constitutional authority to concede the concession. And so state-level companies operate under the concession of municipalities. And to privatize, each municipality should approve privatization, which made the deal very expensive. And so any effort to privatize metropolitan region-wide systems had no companies interested, because it was such a complicated institutional story that it was a very high risk to undertake. So the privatization only worked of sewage systems only worked at municipal level. In Brazil, of course, better off ones, because it's a profitable matter. So there is an institutional story behind that. And, well, these three policies are these three services are provided by municipalities. There was a paradigm change after 1988, and so the policy making is by municipalities. But as for education, there is again a statewide system of cross-jurisdiction subsidies, and there is a lot of regulation by the national level, and the same for education. So for all these policies, for health, municipalities run basic systems, but there is a lot of regulation by federal laws, and there is a lot of transfers toward municipalities to induce the supply of services. Actually, the only municipal system where the municipal level capacities can explain anything is garbage collection.
Alone.
Huh?
Alone.
Alone, yeah. So the remaining ones are multi-level systems with a lot of connections, which makes coordination for funding, decision, investment, very, very complicated, which I think explains in a certain degree the speed of each one.
Thank you, Marta. Peter, your final comments?
I think actually what you've just said is the sewage, because it is so-called lumpy, it's a lumpy service to provide, and you need water beforehand. I just wanted to reiterate the fact that the idea of ownership, I mean, it is self-declared ownership, and people in informal settlements, if they've invaded or they've purchased illegally, they're building their own homes, they're politicking for services, they do say, we're the owners. Whether they're the formal owners or not. They have, some of them never become the de jure owners. Some do through regularization, as you said, but as far as they're concerned, they're owners. And that's exactly the sort of the switch around from rental to ownership is explained in that way. In Mexico, the first census, I think that in 1970, when you began to see this, they didn't actually say owners. You had owners, renters, and others. And the others was getting so big that they realized that they were going to, the penny dropped. They put them into the owner category. Just going back to your the fact that you've been doing this city within the city's work, I assume you can begin to drill down from 2000 onwards. I think you mentioned 2000, 2010.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a really fertile area of where you can geo-reference and where you'll be able to differentiate between favelas and other forms of precarious settlement or loteamientos, or whatever you want to call them. But thank you both.
Okay, a round of applause to the panel.
A quick break. We are still on time. As promised, the sun is out.
Wow.
See, there is hope. So we reconvene in 10 minutes for the final panel.
This is a seminar well organized.